If you alienate your partners, your channel motion is going to be undermined and won't work. So in order to do that, like one of the things you have to do is be really tight about deal registration, right? Because you're going to have partners that are selling into the same verticals, the same segments, the same territories. And so if you have a very tight deal registration process and set of rules that everyone is aware of, both internally and from a partner perspective, you can avoid those conflicts by just pointing to the rules.
This is Sales Ops Demystified, the number one most downloaded podcast in sales operations. We invite the brightest minds in sales ops onto the show to deconstruct the what, why, and how behind rep productivity, forecasting, metrics, and all things revenue. This podcast is brought to you by EBSA, a revenue intelligence platform used to identify risk in the pipeline and score customer engagement, and is sponsored by the Global Sales Operations Association and the UK Revenue Operations Network. Hello and welcome to another very special episode of the Sales Ops Demystified podcast. Today, we're joined by Gabe Rothman, who is the Senior Director of Revenue Operations at Rescale. Gabe, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And let's kick things off by understanding your roots into sales/RevOps, because I understand you were potentially a more generalist operations person, and then you managed to find your way into the revenue function. So A, is that correct? And B, how did that happen?
Sort of. If you go far enough back in my career, I actually started before I even worked in operations. I was an attorney, which didn't work for me. It wasn't the right job for me. So when I made the career switch into ops, yes, initially it was pretty general because I started in consulting. This is kind of how I was able to transition over. So I worked for a company called Blue Wolf, which is now owned by IBM. They were, and I guess still are, a pretty major partner in the Salesforce ecosystem. And so, yeah, at that point, I was doing a lot of learning. And then as I kind of got my feet wet in that world, had to be pretty general, right? We had a number of customers across a bunch of different verticals and segments. And as a result, they had fairly substantially different sales processes. And yeah, we had to be fairly generally knowledgeable about a host of different things in sales, marketing, customer success. But as I kind of learned about the technical aspects of Salesforce and broader like go-to-market technologies in that role, sort of discovered that I had kind of a knack for technical solutions and systems architecture and whatnot. And so my first job at PagerDuty actually narrowed my focus significantly. I was recruited to join at a client at the time called OpenDNS. And OpenDNS is now owned by Cisco Meraki. Their director of sales ops, who was my point of contact, left and went to PagerDuty and recruited me to join him there. So I was very focused at PagerDuty on the systems component. And then obviously, at the time that I joined, it was like 90 people. So a company that size, you have to do more than just your narrow focus. But my primary focus was there. And then it started to broaden again. I moved on to Lookout, where we're still primarily focused on systems, but broadened a bit more, and in a director role. And Lookout was interesting because we were sort of I would characterize it as like a Series A startup inside of a Series D startup. Not to go down too far down the rabbit hole, but essentially when I joined Lookout, Lookout's primary business was B2C and B2B2C. So they initially were a freemium product, right? download it onto your phone. And if you like the premium security features, you could pay for it. And then the B2B2C element that later evolved was partnerships with carriers, right? So you come bundled. When I joined, it was to help them build out a B2B business, which is for companies that wanted to do like mobile device, like bring your own mobile device programs or even corporate mobile device programs, but they wanted to have it all rolled under a single management umbrella, right? So we'd integrate with mobile device management platforms. And so we basically built a direct sales model and a two-tier channel distribution model from the ground up within there. So, you see more sort of like broadening, and then Mesosphere and onto Rescale that continued to broaden as I started to run my own teams, and kind of brings us up to date.
Got it. There's actually, mentioning Mesosphere, I'd like to go into a little bit more detail about one thing you did there. So we're talking about increasing SQLs by 30%, despite having a stricter MQL criteria. And you did that by rebuilding the whole funnel process. So could you just explain like what you changed there and what the impact was?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it wasn't all that magical. When I joined Mesosphere, the marketing team had a particular philosophy about qualification and qualification criteria that I didn't agree with, and we didn't have like a formal marketing ops person in seat at the time. So having kind of a knowledge base around marketing ops, I kind of pressed the issue and was eventually able to get them to change it. When I joined, we were not doing any traditional lead scoring. Our marketing leader had a point of view that traditional lead scoring was, I don't know, for lack of a better way of putting it, I guess sort of nonsense, right? You're just sort of guessing and applying arbitrary numbers to different types of activities, which is true in a sense when you first build your scoring model, right? But that's why we iterate, right? You build a scoring model and then you look at the data and then you adjust, right? So what they were doing was they had built out an integration with a company called Mintigo. And so our entire scoring model was a predictive model, right? So there was no behavioral component. So it was all demographic and firmographic. And not only demographic and firmographic, but based on whatever special secret sauce Mintigo was using. And so there were a couple of things, like sort of outcomes from that. One is that leads can never re-MQL, right? If they MQL and they're qualified out and recycled, right? We had a recycled stage, but they could never re-MQL from recycled because nothing changes about the firmographic or demographic aspects of the lead, right? The only way something can re-MQL is if there's some behavioral, some intent. So that was one problem. The other problem is that the criteria became too all-encompassing. It was too blunt an instrument. So we were actually sending too much over the fence, right? Which resulted in a lot of wasted effort, right? The SDR team was trying to qualify things that frankly weren't ready to be qualified. Someone may have never interacted with us at all in any way other than to like maybe reply to an email or maybe they filled out a form one time to download some asset they were interested in, right? But they didn't really exhibit any intent. And so by moving us to a more traditional behavioral model and coupling that with the predictive model that Mintigo supplied to us, we were able to actually reduce the number of MQLs that were being thrown over the fence to a more sort of like best practice range. I think we were somewhere in the vicinity of like 40%-ish of leads were MQLing at some point versus it was like, I don't know, way over 50%, 60, 70%, something like that. So we were able to reduce that population, but to a much more manageable, intent-driven grouping, which increased the efficiency of the SDR team.
Makes total sense. And then quickly, before we move over to Alex, just to understand the scope of the role at the moment at Rescale. So how many reps are you responsible for? What's the size of the RevOps team?
So In terms of just salespeople, we've actually been growing pretty rapidly there. So I forget the exact number that we're at right now. It's somewhere in the 30 to 35 reps globally. So we sell in EMEA, America's obviously EMEA, and then within APAC, Japan, Korea, and China. If you expand that to include we have a sales development team, which has two components, a business development team and an account development team. Account development meaning more like strategic, aligned with enterprise sellers. It moves to around like 45 people. And then if you include solutions and customer success, which we also support, it grows to somewhere in the like 60-ish, 65 people range. And my team is, I would say 5.5 people right now. Marketing ops was on my team, and we made an organizational decision to move it into marketing. So marketing ops actually dotted lines to my team right now. The rest of my team is composed of a go-to-market systems director, a deal desk / like sales operations generalist, a business operations director who is in charge of like a variety of special projects, pricing and packaging. He owns our marketing pipeline model. One of those folks that you can just kind of like point him at a problem and just say like, go figure that out. And then we have a kind of a more junior sales operations analyst who kind of supports everyone across the team in a host of different ways.
Amazing. Yeah. Those are the best types of team members, the ones where you can point to a problem and be like, solve it.
Yeah.
Alex,
yeah. He's a sharp dude.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, we must shout out. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks for that, Gabe. It was really interesting. There's two areas that I just wanted to pick out from what you were saying that I thought were really interesting. I'd love to dive into some more detail on. The first was when you talked about building out this 2-tier kind of selling model with both direct and channel partners. And I know talking to a lot of people that trying to scale their partner selling or their channel selling is an issue currently. And I just wondered if you had any advice that you could give us around how you did that and sort of techniques to apply, etc.
Yeah. So in terms of building out that model, well, I mean, one thing was, and I will give Lookout a lot of credit for this, that frankly had nothing to do with me. They invested appropriately in the right resources to build that out. So when I joined, we weren't really doing it in a vacuum. Right? We had brought over a global channel sales vice president, and we actually hired channel account managers in region across all of our global sales sites. So in that respect, the infrastructure was there immediately. I mean, just in terms of like general best practices, one thing you always have to be super careful of, especially if you're going to do parallel direct and channel sales, is ensuring that you set up a sales process that avoids channel conflict, right? If you alienate your partners, your channel motion is going to be undermined and won't work. So in order to do that, like one of the things you have to do is be really tight about deal registration, right? Because you're going to have partners that are selling into the same verticals, the same segments, the same territories. And so if you have a very tight deal registration process and set of rules that everyone is aware of, both internally and from a partner perspective, you can avoid those conflicts by just pointing to the rules, right? And hopefully, if you do it right, you don't have to sort of arbitrate conflict very often, because those registrations will come through, and you'll have a tight feedback loop between the channel account manager and your direct sellers, who will, the channel account manager will make sure that those deal registrations are validated before they're accepted. And ostensibly, once that's done, you should be able to go ahead and sell in a parallel manner without having that conflict. So that's certainly one thing that I would make sure to have. The other thing that I think is really important is to have a very well-developed, easy-to-use partner community. And this is something that I believe in, actually, just generally in RevOps. Everything that can be automated should be automated. with sellers, you want to eliminate administrative load as much as possible. And you really want to focus, because you only have a limited amount of like administrative asks that you can really ask your sellers to do. Once you hit, a sort of threshold tipping point, they're just going to stop doing it. So, and the same goes for channel partners, right? And it's even more important with channel partners because they have their own CRM, most likely, that they're working in. And so if you're asking them to do double duty, you need to create a system that allows them to very easily, enter and manage their business with you.
Right, thanks. That's very helpful, and could be quite a competitive edge as well. If you've made your partner system so much better than any of your competitors, then they're much more likely to want to sell yours because it's just easier. So, thank you. The other thing just was touching on, you were talking about scoring models and iterating through them. And I just thought that's, just really, really fascinating area to explore further. And if I got this right, so you'd had just a purely kind of essentially ICP model at the business, looking at just technographing affirmative data and then pretty much just saying, do they fit? Yeah, chuck them over. No kind of pre-qualification. What would you then suggest you also look for on the behavioral side? So what would your kind of key pieces be, and how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like there's sort of like baseline best practice type stuff that everyone should do. I mean, you obviously need to have some type of scoring around like email engagement. There's the standard categories of marketing outreach that you're doing. You need to have some sort of content scoring, like for downloads. Maybe you have high value, low value assets, content syndication programs. If you're doing that, not everyone does content syndication, but if you're doing content syndication programs, scoring around that, webinars, corporate events, field events, right? So all of these different types of interactions have to have an associated value, right? And so initially, you're just kind of painting with a broad brush, right? Like the absolute, like the scores themselves, like the actual numbers, they don't really matter. And what I mean by that is like in a vacuum, whatever the score for any individual thing is, doesn't matter. They only matter in relationship to one another, right? So you can score it on whatever scale you want. I mean, 1 to 100 is something that everyone can like sort of grok, right? So that's generally a good place to kind of like start. But I mean, it's you sort of sit down, and the way we approached it was to sit down and look at like, hey, what do we think our most valuable stuff is, and then kind of work back, right? And you can even sort of take the approach of working in from both sides, right? Like think about like, okay, well, what is like our sort of atomic unit of value from a behavioral perspective? It's probably an email open, right? That's probably the simplest, lowest value interaction that you can get, right? So maybe you start with like, okay, that's a point. And then on the other end, what is your highest value action? I don't know. Maybe if you have like a corporate event that you run, to use an extreme example, like Dreamforce, right? Paying for and attending Dreamforce is especially if they're not a customer, is a pretty high value thing for someone to do, right? So you sort of start in the end and kind of work your way in and try to like develop a scoring model that is relative to those things. And then over time, you can start to run metrics that are correlative to close, right? You look at like, well, our best deals, right? Our highest value deals, or our highest velocity deals. What are the things that happened on those, and start to try to make, guesses, educated guesses, but guesses about, was that correlation meaningful, right? So, like for example, maybe we have field event attendance as higher value than like some of our highest value download assets. Well, maybe it turns out that actually the correlation is reversed. So maybe we adjust those things. And so it becomes like a process over time of trying to dial in that scoring model to correspond to those business KPIs.
Great, thanks. So I'm quite interested because I've been building out with actually a couple of different customers of ours some sort of account-based selling strategies around sort of target accounts, and we're sort of proposing a fairly broad ICP to dictate the target accounts, and then a two-piece strategy within that. One is essentially what you talked about, which is very much the classic marketing score side. What's the engagement with us as a brand? And then the other side is the intent data to say, well, actually, are they looking like they're active in the marketplace for a solution? And then obviously, if they're active, we're looking to drive outward communications to them, depending also on how they've been consuming our interests. So, if they're also engaged with us, then that's great. Then that's a different tone. And if they're not, then we're trying to put that kind of competitor analysis and just trying to work out that sort of model, and then using our product to help show the actual person-to-person engagement. So the SDRs pick it up and then sort of start driving it through the process and make sure that we're engaging with those most prime leads or accounts at the right time. So it's just interesting when you talked about intent. I wasn't sure if you would see that as part of the engagement with your material, whether as you said, events or collateral, or whether you see also a place for that sort of third-party intent data to just generally show activity in the marketplace.
I do. I think that third-party intent is important, especially when you're talking about target or like more account-based stuff, right? Because with target accounts, you're essentially saying that these accounts are qualified, period, right? We don't care if they're engaging with us. That's why we're targeting them. We think they're important enough that they are by default qualified. And so in that realm, that intent data helps with that level, that account level qualification. And then the sort of like behavioral engagement helps you to prioritize, well, who should we reach out to within that account, right? I mean, there's probably people that you're targeting in an outbound capacity regardless, but you can't always necessarily get a hold of those people. So if you can prioritize based on the actual engagement with your company assets, maybe that's like the chink in the armor that you can kind of skate through to get to those higher ups that you're trying to access.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Really helpful. Tom, you're going to come back and wrap up?
Yes. There we go. I think the core thing for me was, it's actually something I didn't mention in the interview, but I thought it was quite interesting how you were saying in the previous role, you kind of came in and there wasn't a marketing ops person, but you said that actually maybe we should do the lead scoring this way. And then you in the next role, you transitioned over to becoming, for the first time, I believe, like RevOps. So it's quite an interesting journey, I think, here that you went through to understand that maybe actually having the revenue operation managed by one person, even though the marketing ops team is not directly reporting to you now. I thought that was quite an interesting insight. I should have brought it up in the interview, but that's what I think is quite interesting. Should be quite interesting for the audience. Also, the whole lead scoring thing I think was quite fundamental that you did improve there. So, Gabe, big question to finish: who in the world of sales ops or RevOps would you most like to take for lunch?
Oh wow, it's a very good question. I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna give you an answer. So my sort of 3-time boss and mentor, who was the gentleman that recruited me to join him at PagerDuty, who I then followed to both Lookout and Mesosphere, who is a great sales ops leader and a good friend, who, because of COVID, I haven't seen in quite a while. Would love to take him to lunch. His name is David Hong. He is the, I forget his exact title. I think it's VP of Global Field Operations at GitLab. And he is just a great leader, a great guy, super sharp. So yeah, would love to take Mr. Hong to lunch again because I haven't seen him in a while.
Shout out to Mr. Hong. Gabe, I want to thank you for being so generous with your wisdom, and I want to thank you for coming on Sales Ops Demystified.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Love to do it again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sales Ops Demystified podcast. If you are listening on a podcast listening application, then please subscribe, rate, and review. And if you have any questions about the show, if you know a guest, or if you have any questions about sales operations, just hit me up at tomhunt@ebster.com. That's tomhunt@ebster.com.